This question comes in from Gray Nixer over on Twitter. Gray Nixer asks, I wonder if the time of complaining about about memory consumption is over. Heck, I have 16 gigs of RAM on this laptop. Is it us being stuck in our old ways complaining about memory usage? Oh, Gray Nixer, probably, perhaps, maybe a little bit, but fundamentally, no. We should be using as little RAM as possible everywhere. Period. End of story. Because there's always going to be certain use cases where having more RAM is infinitely beneficial. When we're talking about crunching huge amounts of data, being able to load it all into RAM is handy. So for those sorts of things like video editing or honestly really complex games or the like, having more RAM is helpful. We're going to always push the boundaries of what's possible by adding in more RAM, more CPU power, all of it, more. But for most things that our operating system and the core applications we use every day, for the most things that they do, there is very little good reason to constantly be gobbling up more RAM, like an insatiable Pac-Man that eats RAM instead of white pellets. There is no reason for that, other than it serves to slow down the software we have further. Now, as we get more powerful processors, more powerful GPUs, more RAM, faster hard drives, the slower machines will get faster anyway. The slower software will increasingly become faster and faster anyway. But if you take older software that was built for machines with less RAM or slower processors or slower read speeds on your drives, they absolutely fly so crazy fast on modern hardware. So why wouldn't we, as consumers, users, developers, etc., want our software to just scream, right? What's better, slow and bloated or screamingly fast and lightweight? Right? And if you really, really look at it, the majority of the software that's getting extremely bloated nowadays, it does not have that many more new features compared to what it had 10 years ago, or even in many cases 20 or 30 years ago. And that's not me throwing random hyperbole out there. That's just the fact. Desktop operating systems. If you have a desktop environment, whether it's a Linux desktop environment, old Windows, old Mac, Amiga, whatever, it doesn't matter. Old desktop environment. Let's say you put some files on your desktop in a folder or in a couple of folders. Can you do that 20 years ago? Yep. Can you do that 30 years ago? Yep. Most of the time anyway. Can you do that now? Yep. Is your ability to put files on your desktop significantly more advanced and amazing than it ever was in the past? Nope, it is not. The icons might be a little bit higher resolution, but that's really the end of what we're talking about here in terms of benefit. Now, that again, though, it's important to remember, that's not to say there aren't areas where using a ton of RAM is incredibly beneficial. I mean, heck, some software really benefits from more RAM being thrown at it, but most does not. And that includes web browsers. There might be some functionality in web browsers that a little more RAM is helpful. The majority of what it does should be able to be done in, 15, 20 megabytes of RAM. Really should be able to. Rendering a static HTML page, which should be 99% of what a web browser does. If it's not, both web browser developers and web designers are doing something wrong. Oh man, I made a lot of people mad just there with that. Wow. But if you're just narrowing it down to the core of what the software should do, 15, 20 megabytes should be plenty. I want to say Netscape Navigator or Netscape Communicator was a 5 or 4 or whatever. One of the big releases of Netscape ran at like 9. Was it between 9 and 12 megabytes of RAM? It's ridiculous how big it's gotten nowadays. And I'm fine with RAM usage growing. but I'd like to see people actually worry about the usage, because a little bit of growth is fine, right? Like, so I've got Firefox running right here using 18.75 gigawatts of RAM, and it's going to grow. Based on the track record of Firefox and Mozilla, that web browser is going to grow in web usage, in RAM usage, by leaps and bounds over the coming years. Same with Google Chrome and all of it. It's going to grow, right? It's been growing, so it's going to keep growing. The developers behind it have shown very little interest in reducing that RAM usage, so it's going to grow. If I keep adding more RAM to my computer every year, but my RAM usage keeps going up, either keeping pace or outpacing it, what was the point of getting the new RAM? It doesn't allow me to crunch bigger number sets because, well, all my RAM is being gobbled up by friggin' Firefox. So yes, we are stuck in our old ways. But in this case, Gray Nixer, who I'm assuming is completely with me based on nothing but your Twitter handle, we are right. That's just all there is to it. We're absolutely right. Many people will say, well, that's ridiculous. I have 16 gigs of RAM. I have 32 gigs of RAM. I have 64 gigs of RAM. And that's awesome. I've got a ton of RAM in this beast too. This beast back here I've got sitting behind me, tons of RAM in here. Tons of it. Huge amounts of RAM. And you know what? It's got so much RAM that most of the time I don't come close to gobbling it all up, even with a ton of web browser tabs open. That's how much RAM I got in there. As time goes on, based on the past track record of web browsers and desktop environments and the like, there will come a point not too far from now where all of the RAM will be used up with a couple of web browser tabs open. And that's where the problem is. When developers aren't focusing on keeping their things lean, keeping their software light and nimble, it gets increasingly bloated to a ridiculous degree. And the more big and cumbersome and bloated and RAM-hungry an application gets, the bigger the odds are that you're going to have memory leaks and all sorts of stuff, and it's just awful. So yes, we should complain about memory usage, and yes, we are stuck in our old ways. Absolutely, both are true, and I stand by that wholeheartedly. Absolutely. Anyone who doesn't believe me on this, go grab an old machine. And when I say old machine, I'm not talking like a 10-year-old computer. I'm talking like late 80s, maybe early 90s. Something with like, I don't know, let's say between 4 and 16 megs of RAM, or 32 megs of RAM if you want to. Something real beefy that way. Grab it, put a web browser on it. Yes, they're available. Windows 3.1, old Mac OS, those all have web browsers. Amigas, those all have web browsers. And you know what? Other than a handful of features that are not highly RAM intensive, some of them are a little bit more RAM intensive than what's currently in them, but not gigabytes of RAM. We're talking a couple megs here and there. Other than those little couple of features, those are entirely usable systems. Most of those features that cause problems using old web browsers, by the way, are just SSL versions, because SSL versions keep getting rolled over, and so they don't last very long, which results in software being end of life before it needs to be end of life. Wow, I could be grumpy about that topic for a while, but yes, go try out old systems. Notice how with a few more megabytes of RAM, you should be able to have a system as functional as what we have nowadays with just a few more megabytes, and we're not talking gigabytes here. So yeah, I'm stuck in my old ways, and it feels good. Brought to you by Lulzbot. I was thinking about the Pogo Linux rig behind me, which is glorious. But this episode's brought to you by Lulzbot 3D printers. They got new 3D printers out. They got these workhorse, bad Bama Jamma, huge 3D printers. Go over to lulzbot.com because they've got the Lulzbot Mini, which is it's not this big. It's not this mini. It's still a big 3D printer, but it's not like huge. But they've got some new 3D printers over there that are just go to lulzbot.com. If you do any like serious hardcore 3D printing, go check it out. It's absolutely rad. And of course, you can go to lunduke.com or these other URLs and click on things, and then probably yell at me. That's probably what's going to happen. Is you're probably going to yell at me. So I'll see you later.